Recently, the Society for Vascular Surgery has decided to sponsor an audiovisual archive to feature the outstanding leaders and contributors in vascular surgery. A committee composed of Jimmy Yao, Norm Rich, Cal Ernst, and me was formed to undertake interviews of our most famous and distinguished colleagues. My name is Roger Gregory, and today I will be conducting an interview with the legendary surgeon, Dr. Frank Spencer, in New York City. Dr. Spencer, thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Yes, sir.
Now, you were born in West Texas, a farm boy, is that right?
Yes. Half mile to the nearest house.
Tell me about your parents.
Well, my mother was an orphan at age 6 or 7. I don't know. My grandfather, I never knew. He was a physician, but he died when my father had just started college. So my grandmother wanted him to come home and look after her and the property. So he never got back to college. It was her fault. But he was a hard-working man and a good rancher and farmer. But he always felt like he was frustrated by not being able to go to college. So he told me that he was very anxious for me to go to college. And that was quite remarkable because in that community, and just after the Depression years, 90% of the people didn't go to college. And the 10% that did, about half of them quit and came back home because they all became farmers and ranchers. And his big concern was I wouldn't want to go to college because nobody else did.
Now, in your early education, you were taught by your mother.
Yes, she was a remarkable coincidence I'm very grateful for because it was my good fortune, not planning. She noticed that I could like picture books and other things, and so that one thing led to another. Of course, I don't remember it. I'm 3 or 4 years old. So they enrolled me in this little 2-room country schoolhouse when I'm almost 7. And my parents were both fairly timid people. And they told the teachers in this 2-room schoolhouse that I could read and write fairly well, and I knew the multiplication tables.
Now, how did you get back and forth?
A horse.
Ah.
And it was 3 miles, but they told the teachers and set my whole career. Because they said, we think he might be ready for the 2nd grade, not the 1st. And the teachers apparently received that information with a certain amount of contempt. They said it almost never works, that we'll try it for a week and see, but it usually doesn't work. After a week, they put me in the 3rd grade. And you're very grateful for your good fortune because this is my mother who had no formal education beyond grade school and high school, teaching me to read and write. And that set my whole career.
What happened about high school? Where did you go for that?
It was, I rode a school bus to the big town of Haskell, 7 miles away, population 3,000. So that was high school.
But you did well in high school.
Yeah.
Small class, but you did very well.
Well, I was so-called valedictorian, number 1 or something.
At North Texas State, where you went to college, with a chemistry major, I think one of the seminal things in your career started there in that you didn't have an easy time getting to college.
No, going to college, my father was very anxious for me to go to college. He didn't know anything about colleges. We looked at some universities were too big for a 15-year-old from the farm, because I'm 15. And there are 10,000 students, not for me. I could hunt and fish, but people scared me to death.
Right.
And one of my high school teachers came back from working in college on a summer course, and asked my father where I was going to go to college. This was August. I said, he didn't know yet. He hadn't made up his mind because the Bible schools were too small. And he said, I think you'd like my college at Denton, Texas. And why don't he come down next Saturday? I have an extra cot in my room. He can stay there and look at the college. So I went down and looked at the college of friendly people, 1,800 students. I said, I think I like this place. I'll enroll. So I enrolled on the spot by myself.
Besides that science teacher that took an interest in you, you also had college teachers that had a deep interest in their students and also in you. What was that? Why
well,
was
the
that?
teachers, I think it's a bygone age, but Texas, when decades before, when they settled the western and northern parts, they had a great interest in available public education. So they built a 2-room country schoolhouse every 6 miles. Built hundreds of them. And it was physically impossible to be more than 3 miles from school, because you had a schoolhouse every 6 miles. That's the reason I rode a pony, because we were 3 miles away. But they had the investment in it, and to further it, as far as being accessible, they built about 7 or 8 teachers' colleges over the state to train teachers to teach in these country schoolhouses. And there was the North Texas State and the East Texas State and the West, geographically named. And the teachers were some of the best I've ever seen. And all my career has been in the universities, but these were teachers whose career was dedicating to teach their students how to teach. And they were fabulous teachers there at North Texas at the time. I found I became some of them virtually adopted their students, like foster students, and talked to in their homes and everything with it. And it was very stimulating. Nobody talked to me about medicine. I was majoring in chemistry and mathematics.
Was it your grandfather that prompted you to develop an interest in medicine, the fact that he'd been a GP?
In college at that time, the pre-medical students were considered the dumb bunnies. If you were, the smart ones went into chemistry and mathematics, which I was majoring in. If you weren't smart enough to do well in chemistry and mathematics, you could always go to medical school. And he's pre-med. He's not very bright. And I went with that for a couple of years. The turning point, and I mention this in terms of background because I've seen always interviewed students who had a burning desire to be a physician. Well, I knew my grandfather, but the chemistry and mathematics were interested intellectually, and that was considered the top majors. And this was 1943. It was a red letter day of my life, because I applied to both Texas medical schools, because I thought I'm a Texan, I'm going to stay in Texas. I'm 17. And they both rejected me. Said, you can apply next year. You think 17 is too young for medical school. Well, I was going to turn 18 in 4 months. You turn 18 in 4 months, you get drafted. And so a year later, I'd be seaman first class in the South Pacific. There were dumb letters I got from the 2 schools rejecting me. They apply next year. From where? And I got to find a medical school. Because at that time, the military was short on physicians. It was an incredible advantage, because it's always been in the background. Everybody got drafted or eligible for it when you were 18, but if you were accepted to medical school, they would defer your admission and pay your tuition. You entered the military, they paid you an officer's salary and paid your tuition. Then you could pay it back, which I did in Korea years later. And so I said, well, I better find a medical school. I'm going to get drafted. See, I've got a great, edit this as you like, I've got a great disdain for arrogance, because so much of your good fortune is something that somebody else. So I said, what am I going to do? I've been rejected to the medical schools. I'm going to be 18 in 4 months. I had no advisors. I overheard a conversation in my chemistry class of about 40 students, congratulating somebody I barely knew who got accepted to a place called Vanderbilt. I said, "Where is that?" "Tennessee." "Any good?" "Yeah, well, it's a good school." "Well, I got to do something. I better apply." I told the story how many times because at Vanderbilt fundraising events, because I sent in an application, wrote and got an application, mailed it in, had some letters of reference. 3 weeks went by with no answer, no nothing. They had checked my references. I didn't know whether I got the letter or not. 3 weeks later, I got this cryptic letter like a traffic summons that changed my whole career. It said, "Congratulations, you have been accepted. Our next class starts in September or January. Send us a $50 deposit." Didn't say anything about my age or anything else. That's what took me out of Texas.
You graduated from Vanderbilt in 1947, the top of your class, AOA. Now, why did you decide on surgery?
It was a very good question because I had no great interest in surgery. It was interesting. I was going to be a psychiatrist. Because we had so much of your role model effect in teenagers comes from your teachers.
Yes.
And in college, I had a charismatic teacher of abnormal psychology who didn't realize how good he was. He practically mesmerized his students. I thought, gee, I want to be like him. I'll be a psychiatrist. How do you spell that? I'm not sure. Have you ever seen a psychiatrist? No, I haven't. But that's what I'm going to do. It's a little bit scary because I kept that decision with no data in the first year or two of medical school. Third year in medical school, the first time we see patients. They take us, Vanderbilt is small, so they take us out. My first course was psychiatry. So great, I can see some patients. They took us out to this mental institution where they had these poor people incarcerated for a lifetime. And they brought out a catatonic schizophrenic. And he eventually disappeared with medication. But they had this poor guy in a wheelchair. They held his arm up, and the catatonia means it doesn't move. He held his arm in a fixed position. He held it longer than you could. And finally, the instructor put it down. And that was that dreadful disease at the time. I looked at it and said, "My God, is that my specialty?" That made me a surgeon. I said, if I'm not going to go into psychiatry, I got to do something. And I was in surgery. It was interesting. I said, well, I think that'd be a good choice.
Now, you chose Johns Hopkins to intern in 1947-48. Why Hopkins?
Because most of the class wanted to stay at Vanderbilt, which was an excellent school and had a good reputation. And in the third year, when we applied for internships, listed we wanted to train in surgery, that we got a formal letter from the dean's office that, "Dear Mr. Spencer, you've expressed an interest in surgery. Your faculty advisor will be Dr. Pilcher. You will be in his office next Thursday at 4:15, like a traffic summons." He's brilliant neurosurgeon. He had lectured our class. He didn't know me from nothing. About 4 o'clock, he looks up, and I'm outside the door. "Well, you must be Spencer." "Yes, sir." "Well, come in." "You want to train, sir?" "Yes, sir." He said, "Yeah, but I'd like to train in the East." "Something wrong here?" "Oh, no, it's a great school. You see, Dr. Pilcher, I've never been east of Nashville. And I hear there's some good places in the East. I'd like to try one of them." It sounded sort of ridiculous, but I'm being totally honest. I'd never been east of Nashville. And all the scuttlebutt was that there were some very good schools in the Northeast. And he listened politely. Said, "Well, Spencer, you're right. There are some good schools in the Northeast. You apply to Hopkins and Yale and Rochester. And don't take any of them till you check with me. But I think you'll have a position for you at Hopkins." And yes, sir. Interview took 15 minutes and set my whole career.
And at the end of your 1949, when you'd been a fellow in surgery, suddenly you found yourself in limbo. What was that all about, and what was your response to that?
Well, it was a career-changing decision that Hopkins, like Yale and Harvard, had this despicable system, pyramidal system in the house staff. They would, I think my intern class took 10 interns, very competitive, so they were all very able people. Then they would only had room to keep 2, and they would make that decision after the first year. And what happened to the other 8? Nothing. They had no advisors, no nothing. They just discarded them. And they say they had to give it up years ago because the people wouldn't apply to it. It was a ridiculous system, but it ruined a lot of people I never saw again. They were colleagues of mine because there was no help. And they didn't communicate. So the appointments were made in June for July, 1 month ahead in advance. Come April, I haven't heard anything. Do I have a job in July or I don't? And I didn't have any money to travel. And what am I going to do if I don't? I was married. Wife was teaching. And by coincidence, at that time, that was reported that one of the junior faculty, Bill Longmire, had taken the chair at UCLA. I said, hey, on my own, I went up and said, congratulations. He didn't know me. I said, I'd like to go with you. And he said, well, fine, you'll be my first chief resident. And so I left Hopkins in '49 with no intention of ever returning.
In 1951, a major area in your life unfolded. Service in the military. You were midway through your surgery training, and suddenly you were cast into the military, the Marine Corps, and became involved in the Korean War.
Initially, I spent a year at the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in the Navy, and then was assigned to the Marine Corps.
But tell us about your time during the Korean War and
Well, it was
with vascular surgery.
no physician wanted to go to the Marine Corps. None. It was usually they assigned the contrary ones, the ones they wanted to get rid of. Because you see, the Marine Corps did not have hospitals. It was a hit and run outfit. Very good and very remarkable people, but their idea was to assault an island, secure it within a few days, turn it over to the Army, and move on and assault another island. It was essentially a hit and run outfit with no medical corps, and it was with no hospitals. So no physician would volunteer. But to supply physicians for them, which is essentially all you could do was sort of first aid in that situation, the Navy would arbitrarily assign physicians from the Navy to the Marine Corps. And it came out of Washington. And that's how I wound up with the Marines. I had a good year because to get deferred in World War II, you had to join the Army or Navy, which I did in the Navy, and was initially assigned to a naval hospital for a year, and then the Marine Corps.
When you got to Korea, though, what you ran into was a little startling.
Yeah, they say I didn't arrive in Korea with any enthusiasm. So I'll survive. So you arrive in this dreadful-looking country, and you wonder what in the devil are we doing here. It was a freak of circumstance because the truce teams, because of the negotiations, they had this no-fire zone, and for 6-mile circle. And if you were in the circle, you hadn't have to worry about gunfire, as long as they kept talking. If they stopped talking, they'd blow you off the map because you're full range of enemy artillery. But the big advantage of this that made them feasible was that put an operating area closer to combat than it had ever existed in history. In World War II, you had to move them some distance back. You certainly had to be out of enemy artillery range. And what was not known at the time was that if you can't fix an artery within 6 or 8 hours, you better amputate because the leg muscle is dead. And so that when moving them up close to the lines provided surgical facilities. There were 2 Quonset huts that but you had an operating room. And 2 huts you could work in, and you were 2 miles from the line. An additional thing that had come in were helicopters. And the helicopters' pilots were fabulous. Right in the middle of the night, they were combat. They'd go up in their helicopter without lights, flying low on the ground and pick up a wounded man and bring him in. So you had access to wounded people closer than had existed in history. I think the evacuation time could be 30 minutes because the pilots were fabulous because they say, where he is, we'll go get him. And they bring in, so you get in these collection of casualties. And it was an interesting environment because it was essentially structured to resuscitate wounded men. Give blood, get out of shock, stop the bleeding, and then send them back to a base hospital. But as they'd been talking for a year, they gradually moved, had a little operating room. We had 2 of them in the building, what I call Quonset huts or something like that. But they were adequate. I was going to be chief of surgery in this little tent.
In the Quonset hut.
Had about 8 officers and about 70 corpsmen in the collection of tents on the hillside. I'm chief of surgery. So I look around, and one of the first patients they showed me was an 18-year-old with a dead foot. He had a little wound of his superficial femoral. And that was all. I said, that was 3 days before, so it had to be amputated. I said, why didn't you fix it? Contrary to orders. What do you mean, orders? I never heard this before. They opened up the rule book, 100 pages, like a traffic direction, and it said very clearly, all arterial injuries will be ligated. A clear sentence, no discussion, nothing. All injuries will be ligated, which they had been doing for the last year or 2, because conflict had been going on a couple of years. And I looked at this, and it was a major decision. And I guess it's the Hippocratic Oath, what to do best for the patient, not for you. I thought, gee, if I follow orders and ligate them, I'll have to amputate. If I violate orders and do what's best for the patient, I'll probably get court-martialed. Oh, well, to hell with it. I didn't volunteer to come here anyhow. And it's a touching story for medicine that's in the ethic of do what's best for the patient. Because there was 4 or 5 other people who wanted to participate. I had to teach them how to sew an artery because I knew how. That was the only one that knew how. I said, this is a great experiment. If it succeeds, we get a decoration. If it doesn't, we get court-martial. Said, does anyone want not to participate? And to a man, all 5 of them said, let's go.
Now tell me a little bit about the vascular clamps that you had at that time.
Well, there were no clamps. We had 2 bulldog clamps, or maybe 4. But in the interning at Hopkins with a blue baby operation, and say the POTS clamp didn't appear until about 49. And in doing the blue baby operations, you would tie a bulldog clamp on the subclavian and tie the end of it with a ligature so it wouldn't slide off, and then you could pull on it. And so that was what we proceeded to use with arteries. We put on our bulldog clamps and tied on them, we could pull them together. That's all we had all the time I was there, because I kept applying for POTS camps, which I knew familiar with, no answer. Nothing.
But you finally did get some POTS clamps.
Yeah, that was after about 6 months. And it was a strange thing. It was because this Army Jeep pulled up, and the Army treated the Marine Corps with a good bit of disdain because they were Navy, they were competitors. and this Jeep pulled up, and this nice man, Carl Hughes, got out, was a colonel, and he looked at what we were doing, and sort of shook his head in dismay, and without any comment, he went over to his Jeep, out of the compartment. He took 2 Potts clamps and gave to me. I couldn't believe it.
Manna from heaven.
And I've been requesting them for months, and I didn't learn for about 30 or 40 years it came from John Howard. He was in Southern Korea, and he had ordered some clamps, and he ordered some for his facility, and he said, send me 2 pair for somebody in the Marine Corps who's trying to fix arteries named Spencer. And so Hughes was dispatched to deliver the clamps.
Now, after you completed your time in the service, you returned to Hopkins. This time, you were well accepted and completed your residency.
They gave me a decoration that leads to merit.
Yes.
And all this, made you feel good. I was a bit talking to myself, so yeah, we did it. We get a decoration. If it hadn't worked, we'd have been court-martialed. We were violating orders. So I didn't consider the medal a skeptical eye. But I say it set a career, because the military, at the end of my tour, I had a few months, about 2 or 3 months left, wanted me to report to Washington and come back and report and give a short report. The AMA was having an annual meeting. They stuck me on the program to talk about this. So I went back and bumped into a colleague that was on the program at the AMA, and some of the senior surgeons at Hopkins, who was a good friend of mine, who was 3 or 4 years senior, Henry Bonson, I saw the meeting, we talked. And I'm doing my last 6 weeks of military service at Bethesda. I reported to the Navy and told them the background. And I got the word that the professor wanted to see me at Hopkins, Blalock. Well, I can't say no. Anyway, just wanted to interview me. And he came over, an interesting interview that he said was a aloof person, a brilliant guy. He was not friendly, aloof. He said, well, you've done very well. I'd like for you to come back on you say you're training, we're going to train at UCLA, but they haven't built the hospital yet. And they'll build one sometime, but you might be an old man fan. And I want you to come back to Hopkins and complete your training, and you've had all this military experience, so we'll skip 3 or 4 years, and you'll be an assistant resident for a few months, and you can be chief. Unbelievable offer. I was so angry with Hopkins for their behavior, I said, well, that's very generous, I'll think about it. And I kept him waiting 3 weeks. I went and asked 2 or 3 senior surgeons that I knew what I should do, because I had this big loyalty to UCLA, but Longmire was in Europe. I couldn't contact him in the military service, and UCLA wasn't built. And everybody I talked to said, well, you'd be crazy not to take it. You're skipping 3 years, but 2 or 3 years of training, so after 3 weeks, I said the word, okay, I'll take it. But that was rather unusual circumstances what took me back to Hopkins, because when we left there, I told my wife on the train to California, I said, we're never going to see that damn place again.
Now, you mentioned your wife. Tell me about when you got married and the children. And
we married when I was when I was finishing my 3rd year in medical school. They were Tennesseans. And she was a fine wife, passed away. We were married 61 years, passed away a couple of years ago. But that her father was a prominent Tennessee attorney, been in the legislature. And he apparently told a friend one time that he thought his daughter had good sense until now. Because she's graduating from college with a degree in teaching. The Southern women didn't work at that time. Said she can't do a thing. She can't even fry an egg. Now she's marrying a medical student with no money and going to go to work teaching to support him, which she did for about 5 years, very cheerfully.
Now, after you had completed your residency, here you were, a very well-trained surgeon, having evolved from modest circumstances as a young Southern farm boy. Wow.
I thought about it, I think it's the American culture. Because in this country with the minimal class system, if the Lord gives you a good brain, and you work, you got to work. You can't tell what'll happen. Because I'm off to college at 15. Scared, people scared me, stranger, but exciting. In class, chemistry or physics or something. And I noticed that in listening to the lecture the classes were about 50 minutes, everybody's writing like amazing, making notes. And I found by accident that if I was writing, I couldn't listen as well. So that if I listened and didn't write, I could understand it better. And the value of a good memory, because that night or after class, sometime later during the day, and within the next 24 hours, you could write down some notes of what the lecture was about. And so I stopped writing. And there was apparently a bizarre thing in a class of 40. Everybody was writing except Spencer. He's sitting there. And it bothered the teacher. He went over in front of me and said, "Aren't you going to make any notes?" I said, "No, sir, I'm listening." He shook his head in dismay. They took grades and posted numerical grades on the board. Who did what? I came in at the top of the group with a 99. And then everybody started looking at me. Who's this freak from the farm? I was very embarrassed, so I pretended to make notes so they'd stop looking at me.
Now, when you went into practice, this was a move from rural to urban. And I think most revealing in this is that you refused to take a position that did not involve teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Was that a conscious decision?
Yeah. Because it's a marvelous instinct in medicine. I've talked about many times, Roger, that is the instinct of teaching the next generation. Because you're in business, you want to get a jump on the competitor. You're not interested in teaching him anything. You want to get ahead of him. In medicine, if you find something significant, say in Boston, you're perfectly glad to pay your own expense to San Diego 6 months later and go out and tell them all about it and hope they'll applaud. And that teaching instinct is what makes medicine a great profession.
Now, you stayed at Johns Hopkins until 1961, but then something happened between you and Ben Eisman. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Hopkins at that time, and this is a long time ago, I was between 55 and 61. It was essentially almost slave labor. Because as a junior, as an assistant professor, I had a salary of something like 10 or 12,000 a year. And I got a scholarship from the Markle Foundation that paid 5,000 a year. And not relevant to this, but the dean congratulated me and said, "That'll fine, that'll help pay the cost of your expenses," and gave me a $1,000 raise and kept the rest of it. So that I'm having a good time at Hopkins because it was very exciting colleagues with the colleagues and friends, but starving, got 3 children. And Ben Eisman had taken the position as chairman in Kentucky, in a new school. And my wife was showing the strain. I never said anything to anybody. I was trying to look after 3 kids with no money, and which you could get along with as long as they didn't have to go to school. But she was showing more and more resistant with it, so that when Ben Eisman offered me this position, and he was as astonished as anybody when I took it. The salary was twice what was had at Hopkins. And my wife was a Tennessean, And here you are in the middle of bluegrass. I thought, well, what could be better? So to my people's astonishment, when I went to Kentucky to help start the school. I mean, Ben made me vice chairman. I had a good time there.
Yeah. You stayed
And
there.
I moved there with the intention of forgetting this academic career. I got some family to raise. We'll make a home in Kentucky, and that'll be it.
But it wasn't it. You decided 5 years later that maybe New York was attractive. Now, how could New York be attractive to this Texas farm boy?
Well, I thought New York was next to Hades simply. Seriously, I had no interest in New York whatever. I hadn't been there in 17 years, and there's no place to come as a stranger without any money. I mean, it's a nightmare. I'd been here briefly before getting discharged from the Navy. I said, I ain't going back there no more. But an old custom that you know well in the South and the West, at least at that time, was that you've got to be polite. And no matter what the circumstances are, you're polite about it. It may be something you have no interest in. It may be despicable, but you're polite. And it follows from it, just me talking to me, that if someone compliments you by being a candidate for a retiring significant position, it's good manners to say, go visit, and just good manners, and don't string them along, and say, get acquainted, and say thanks, thanks very much for the invitation, but goodbye. So you can do it in 24, 48 hours. But that's really the only interest I came to New York, because I had moved to Kentucky as a permanent home for my wife's background and the like. And I got pestered with all these applications to come look at this chairmanship of some medical school. Well, good manners, I can't say I'm not interested. I got to go say them and be polite. I looked at 5 chairs that year. I went to Yale 3 times, and they had a lot of prestige and a lot of everything, but no money. and to say that I wasn't trying to make a lot of money with it, but I had to educate a family. The president at Yale at that time was a marvelous human being named Kingman Brewster, and he had a particular interest in the medical school. And he had a personality that could sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo. You're a magnetic person. And I'd been to Yale once or twice, and no money. The laboratories looked like dog patch. And I was being polite. And I went up there, I think this was my second visit or something, and here on the phone rings from the laboratory in Kentucky, and it says, Frank, this is Kingman Brewster in Yale. I want to get this surgery chair settled. The dean's away, so I'm taking charge of it. I want you to come up this weekend and stay in my house as my guest so we can really talk. You can't say no to that. Well, I had a marvelous weekend with him because he was a great conversationalist. And the story I'm coming to went all over the country. Monday morning, I'm walking down to my first interview. And every time I brought up a question about salary or lab space, they changed the subject. I kept getting these evasive answers. I get a little annoyed. And we walked around the building and toward the building, and I told him, and by now I'm calling him on the first name. I said, Kingman, I've asked 4 different times about the budget and the laboratories, and I get an evasive answer. And look at that new building you're putting up over there. You're putting up a 10-story building for medicine and something else, and nothing for surgery. I mean, surgery needs it, but you're not doing it. How come? And he said, I'll get back to that. Look at that ivy growing on that building. Didn't that do something for you? And I sort of snapped. I said, damn it, Kingman, ivy's not selling this year. He told that reply all over the country. You know what Spencer told Kingman Brewster? I was correct. It didn't for many years.
But what brought you to New York?
It was the Bellevue.
It was a more attractive offer.
New York was a puzzle in cardiac surgeons because it was a lot of people trying to do heart surgery that weren't trained. Columbia was an exception, but it was very small. But it was a puzzle among heart surgeons that what's wrong with New York? You've got 10 or 20 million people, a lot of heart disease. If you needed an operation, get out of New York. Go to Philadelphia, go to Boston, go to Hopkins, go to Duke, but don't have it done in New York.
That was your challenge.
Well, it was a puzzle. And the interesting combination, because I came up to be polite. Just that. Tell my wife I'll be back in 2 or 3 days. I got to be polite. Say, who the hell wants to live in New York? I think now I've been here 4 generations. But it was a typical Southern reaction. They were very nice to me. And what had happened was a combination of things, because the essence of a good medical school is to have a big hospital, city hospital like Bellevue, where you see the trauma and the poor and others, you see the extremes of disease that's ideal for teaching. Well, Bellevue was known all over the world. Asked me where NYU was. I said, I guess it's New York. Is that what the name means? I didn't know anything about it. So I came up to look at it, and they had just built a new hospital, the Tisch Hospital, about 600 or 700 beds, and they couldn't fill it. Been open for 2 years, had 80 empty beds, and they're losing money hand over fist. There's this new hospital on the same block, and here's the Bellevue, which is world famous, just next door. And at that time, then New York had this negative reputation. And the school didn't have much endowment, so you were expected to earn a lot of your own money, but you could keep it. I said, Jay, if I start a heart surgery in New York with all these people, and I got Bellevue for training, I haven't make enough money to run the whole department. Yeah. Which is an extravagant statement. That's what happened for about 25 years.
Now, I want you to speak for a moment about the overlap in cardiothoracic in which you were trained, and also vascular surgery that was an evolving area as well. I know that you did early work on coronary perfusion, hypothermia, cardioplegia, valve reconstruction, all things that still have an influence in cardiac surgery. But besides that, you were able to focus on vascular surgery as well.
What made the arterial repair in Korea possible was a coincidence of 3 things that had nothing to do with each other. The availability of helicopter evacuation, because if you have a critical injury to a leg, you have to fix it within 6 or 8 hours at the maximum, or this muscle's dead. And if you fix it then, the dead products come out and kill the kidney and the patient. So the Korea had the helicopters, but they didn't understand this, so they put out an order that there would be all arterial injury would be ligated. It was a good order if you can't fix it. And that's what the whole reason the arterial injury repair, because that's a major cause of amputations in warfare. They tried it in World War I, World War II, was a disaster. And the early part of Korea was a disaster. The third thing, you have to know how to fix an artery. And I learned the hard way in teaching, because the training at Hopkins was a blue baby, that you did one every day. All I did was hold the clamps, but you learned how to sew small blood vessels. And applying that to arterial surgery was a big advance, because you could not go from general surgery to arterial surgery directly. It was a different technique, and it was a combination of those 3 that really made it work, the helicopter time and the arterial technique.
I know that you've had a commitment to teaching, and certainly teaching hundreds of surgeons at NYU. Why was this so important to you Why was this, you made this incredible commitment?
Oh, I'm like a Baptist evangelist. if you got something new, you want to tell everybody all about it.
Well, did you want to try to tell them about deductive reasoning?
Well, that's the major teaching point, is that you can record the facts like describing the weather. So that's what happens, so what? Well, what the deduction is in terms of teaching, it was a very valuable one, was what conclusions can you make from these facts? What hypothesis would explain them? And it's not an easy intellectual process, because if you just record them and say that was what it was, so what? At a time with it. With the deduction, the teaching with it, and it's a lifelong experience. You teach people that you look at your experiences, well, and very often they didn't turn out perfectly. There was something wrong. And you look at them and say, what went wrong with that? And what can I do different next time? Because when I did an operation, you have to dictate an operative note, which is a requirement. But then I'd write myself a letter about what I would do different next time. Because there was always something that was not quite right. The needle tore something, or this wasn't that. So what will I do different next? My staff pretended to collect these notes in notebooks, and they became known as the cookbook notes. But before an operation, if you hadn't done one in 6 months, you look at your notes, what did you conclude from one 6 months ago? And you couldn't get it from an operative note, because that's a legal record. You put in what's a legal record, but you're talking to me, this was wrong, this was bad, I'll do this next time, what about this? You're free association, you're talking to yourself. But looking through those notes, and if you had them compiled, you could look back through the last half a dozen you did, what did you learn? And that was an invaluable learning experience with it. And it ties in with that commitment to teach.
I'm impressed with the number of teachers that you had that wanted you to succeed. Why were you so different?
I don't recall many who, I can remember one or two, but I don't remember anybody else who wanted me to succeed. There was certainly not any inspiration from them. It was because these were competitive environments, like that durable pyramid I talked about at Hopkins.
Well,
But the only one I can think of offhand was that, because it's significant, is that what you asked what motivated this farm boy.
right.
And I puzzled about it. I think it's the excitement of learning. If you excitement of doing something and solving it. Blalock's best aspect at Hopkins was, all the way from the Frenchman Claude Bernard, was you got to match the hospital with a laboratory. So you see something that's not right, you try to design an experiment and then test that in the laboratory. And that was deep in the culture at Hopkins. Hopkins expected you to do well as a surgeon, but that's like putting on your shoes. You can operate, but so what? What are you doing in the lab? What do you hear? If you didn't operate well, you just disappeared. There was no discussion. It was pretty brutal. But everybody could operate well, but what you could discover in the laboratory and the investigation was the key with it. And of course, that's the scientific method.
And let me ask you another, perhaps more pointed question. There were hundreds of young cardiovascular surgeons being taught, coming along at this time. Why were you so different?
Probably, and a lot of the credit goes to the Hopkins program and a broad training in general surgery, because that was that professor there emphasized, says, you can specialize later, but if you specialize too early, you'll hurt yourself. And he quoted some people in the previous generation and said the big advances came from people who had a very broad training. And that's the best. I think that's probably it, because I had the emphasis at Hopkins at that time was not was not on cardiac surgery. The blue baby was what they became famous for. But cardiac surgery didn't amount to much. This was in the 1940s. You had the blue baby operation, and you had coarctation of the aorta, and you had pulmonary valvulotomy. So what?
That's it.
What are you going to do the rest of the time? So the big Hopkins program was emphasis on general surgery training. And it was priceless. It gave you a judgment that you could never get if you specialized early.
Let me speak for a moment about your career highlights. Besides hundreds of publications and thousands of operations, the textbook that you wrote with Norman Rich, Vascular Trauma, writing this from two different institutions, this had to be a big task.
I'm an incurable workaholic. And it's the curious instinct, because here I am I'll soon be 86, and I work 5 or 6 days a week. I enjoy working. And it's almost a neurosis, because I feel guilty if I'm not working, like you're goofing off. And I think it's partly the culture of growing up in the Depression, when people were starving, losing their farms, and the Okies and others. We were never in trouble. My father would not borrow money. He owned a farm, and he would not borrow you $100. And he was very scared, because he saw too many people get over their head. But you worked from sunup to sundown. That was about an 8-hour day was outrageous when it came out. But the farmer went to work when the sun came up and you could see, and he quit when it got dark about 8 o'clock. And that workaholic habit made life long with it.
Some other career highlights that were incredible are the fact that you were president of Society of Clinical Surgery, president of ICVS, president of the American Association for Thoracic Surgery, American College of Surgery, American Surgical Association. All amazing. Not to mention the Legion of Merit Award for your work in Korea. And not the least of your career highlights was the Spencer Surgical Society.
It wasn't my idea.
But that's okay. I don't think it was
your
your
resident started that. It embarrassed me. Only thing I couldn't think of, I can't stop it.
Well, you couldn't stop the Legion of Merit either. So these are things you couldn't stop. And I might add to this impressive list the fact that you received the coveted DeBakey Award in 1996. With all of this success, since you were a human being, I realize you must have had low points and failures as well. Did you have disappointments, failures?
Oh, sure.
How did this affect you?
I'm on a troop ship flying to Honolulu for the Marine Corps to parts unknown. This was by myself, 1953, I think. And I look back at 4 or 5 major changes that I had planned things very well, and they all collapsed from no fault of mine. And reflected back, well, I wonder what's next. I had no idea that the Korean thing would be the most useful thing I ever did to help people. And you look at the time with it, because the attitude toward failure, and I've given sermons about this, and I don't know where it came from, I think about that, is that failure is a learning experience. And I taught that, and used to take, that was my cookbook notes. It's not how good you did, what did you do wrong? Because you can change next time. It molds your behavior, that you're not looking for recognition, and you just want it to be perfect. And I was interested one time in that, reading about the famous conductor Toscanini and his strive for perfection. He was being interviewed at age 75. And he said, well, I don't know what prompted the question. He said, look, it's never perfect. I've conducted Beethoven's Fourth Symphony 50 times. I've never quite got it right, but I'm still working on it. And it shows it's the antithesis of arrogance, is that things are very seldom perfect. I was a visiting professor in Germany one time in Heidelberg, and a stranger. They're very good to me. There for a week. Flew from New York on Sunday and arrived the next morning, and here's a junior professor named Michael Trady doing a ventricular septal defect for demonstration, and he was quite good. And he zip, did this, and finished in about an hour and turned around. Well, Professor, what do you think? I said, well, you did it faster than I could. It was very good. You only did 4 things wrong. Room drew back in astonishment, particularly to a German. And I laughed and said, look, you didn't pay my way from New York just to give you compliments, did you? I said, these 4 things you did wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we became quite good friends.
But you weren't saying anything to him that you hadn't said to yourself.
No, of course not.
With every operation.
That was the cookbook notes.
Wow.
And that's a very, and I was intrigued with Toscanini's comment, because here he is, world famous. It was never as perfect as he wanted it. And it's true of many operations. I very seldom did an operation that I did that so well, I can't improve. You learn something very clearly, and there are 3 or 4 things related, but they're not, one doesn't lead to another like a sentence, they're abstract symbols. You memorize them completely. In 16 hours, you can only remember 50%. They're abstract, see, that's not like the dog chased a cat, but he said you never lose it totally. You get down to about 25%, so when you refresh it, you can review it again.
Now, of all the teachers and associates that you had, who were your mentors, and how did they influence you?
I think John Beale, I mentioned earlier, made one thing that's significant. I didn't know about it, because I arrived for naval duty in Oakland, California for a year at a hospital. And he had independently written the chief of surgery that some of my abilities. So rather than getting assigned to a dispensary, they put me in charge of a ward for vascular injuries. And because when I met the chief of surgery, he said, oh, I had this letter from Dr. Beale about you. I know about you, Spencer. We're going to do this. That's the first I knew he wrote a letter. My other teachers, Longmire was outstanding, nationally recognized, and Blalock was nationally recognized. They taught by example. They didn't teach directly. You could learn from watching them. Blalock actually was, he admired his persistence because he was thinking about laboratory things and discovery. And in lecturing, he was just an acceptable B. And it gave me a great compliment one time I didn't learn about for months later, because as junior faculty, they had a traditional weekly surgical conference. And once a year, you were asked to conduct it. Well, I conducted it, talked about appendicitis and appendectomy, 2 or 3 cases. And he told somebody, he says, Spencer, I think, is the best teacher we got.
What a compliment.
It was I cherished that.
I'd like to ask you some specific questions now regarding your opinion. The first is, what is your opinion of endovascular surgery?
It's been advanced in many areas that are doing things that you couldn't do otherwise. And I stopped, it's a long answer to your question, Roger. See, I stopped operative surgery over 10 years ago because I was busy. But my operating times, I'm now in my early 70s, were longer than my colleagues. Patient did okay, but operating times were half an hour longer. And it bothered me, because the patients were all right, but it's not healthy to be asleep with your chest open and have a period of time. And one thing led to another, I remember the detail, but I electively decided to stop operating, kept working, but stop operating. But what I didn't learn for years later is that as you get gray hair, your nerve fibers transmit information more slowly. It's the process of aging. So you can make a decision, it just takes you longer. And it translates into your operating time get longer and longer.
Several years ago, an attempt was made to establish an independent board of vascular surgery. And this was championed by Frank Veith, Jim Stanley, and many others, including me, agreed with this attempt to gain independence from the American board, but this failed. Why?
I didn't follow it because the world changes, and the big trap has been recorded throughout history is keep forgetting that what your experiences were 50 years ago, and they're may or may not be applicable to the present. The broad training in general surgery, and you don't have to do a full Hopkins residency, but was invaluable to my career because it gave me a judgment I wouldn't have otherwise, and it gave me a judgment for being chairman of the department here for ages.
Regarding the attempt to gain independence for vascular surgery, do you think if we had had a diplomat like Frank Spencer on our side, it would have been different?
Well, that's salesmanship. I can't comment rather significantly.
I think we can all agree that American medicine has now become a political football.
Yeah.
Are we losing our way, Dr. Spencer?
The American Medical Association was the most respected, I'm told, was the most respected respected medical organization in this country from at least 1900 to 1920 or maybe 1930. And they got more involved with other things. And I paid dues to them each year. I don't participate otherwise. Just I get the publication and look at it, and etc. But the mission that I like about surgery is going back with the founding of the American College by the founder Franklin Martin, who echoed in 1912. So this organization is formed talking about creating the American College. It's formed for the benefit of patients and the education of the physicians looking after the patients. It's not formed for their profit making but simply for those two things. And I think that's when the organization gets away from looking after a mission for taking care of patients. It deteriorates very rapidly. In human endeavors, that everybody wants to be first, or they'll be claiming with it. And that has nothing to do with taking care of a patient. You want to do the best job possible and keep learning with it. But you get over into political things, you really deteriorate very quickly.
Now, international exchange of surgical residents and fully trained surgeons is on the decline. Is that because, in your opinion, that SVS merged with ISCVS?
No, I think probably because you see, in cardiac and vascular surgery, we were ahead of the rest of the world, because to develop a cardiac and vascular program takes a lot of money. You got to have a laboratory, you got to have equipment, a lot of other things. Most of Europe was devastated with World War II, so that they didn't have the money or the laboratory background. I remember Fritz Linder, the week I spent in Heidelberg, said we're so far behind because of what the Nazis did to us. We got to send our people to USA to catch up. We're a decade behind.
Have they caught up now?
I don't know. They have in transplant. Different ones around, because there are bright people born anywhere. and the area around, but most of the cultures have not caught up. I think probably it may be the structure of this country from all the way from our Constitution. If the Lord gives you some good brains and you work, there are very few limits to what you can achieve.
Now, looking back over your career, what was your favorite operation?
Well, I liked all of them. I was intrigued with operative surgery. And we did our internship at Hopkins from I was 47 to 48. And the last week of our internship, I'm up in the operating room observing them perform a hemorrhoidectomy. And someone asked me what was I doing. I said, just watching. I said, well, I've seen a lot of blue baby operations, but I've never seen a hemorrhoid operation. I want to think I'll learn how.
Do you have any advice for young surgeons?
I only thought is train yourself broadly to start with. I would not go into a specialty too soon, because you lose your judgment for making. You can do very well with existing knowledge, but your capacity to develop any new information is limited.
Dr. Spencer, thank you for making time for this interview.
Just like Moses, I'll be talking all day.
Dr. Spencer was born in the Texas Panhandle. He attended college at North Texas State University in Denton, Texas. Subsequently, both Texas medical schools rejected him because he was only 17 years old. Fortunately, Vanderbilt University in Tennessee promptly accepted his application. He had his surgical training principally at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, interrupted for 4 years at UCLA and by the Korean War. He developed expertise in arterial repair and introduced this skill during the Korean War, which benefited more people than anything I have ever done. He was awarded the Legion of Merit Award. His surgical career has always been in universities, 10 years at Johns Hopkins, 4 years in Kentucky, and over 40 years at NYU, where he was chairman of surgery for over 30 years. He has been president of 3 major surgical organizations: American Surgical Association, American College of Surgeons, and the American Association of Thoracic Surgery. He still works actively at the NYU Langone Medical Center about 5.5 days a week.